Okay, so today I want to talk about the book Patriotic, Treason, John Brown and the Soul of America by Carton, a book that I read recently and was very fascinated by. I first have to say that I have a lot of admiration for John Brown because he's someone who, you can say he was misguided, you can say certainly that he was too much of an idealist and not realistic maybe in his goal, but one thing you can't say about him is that he wasn't a principled person, and he was willing to die for his principles, which I admire. Another thing I really admire about him, as far as being an abolitionist, there were plenty of abolitionists that were around during his lifetime, but many of them were against slavery simply because they didn't want black people living in their community in any capacity, and they weren't so much against slavery as they were against any kind of integration between black people and white people, and then they also didn't want to have to compete with slave labor for jobs, which is perfectly reasonable and understandable, but they weren't opposed to slavery because they felt it was morally wrong necessarily, or because they had any belief that black people were entitled to the same rights and dignities as white people were. A lot of them did not believe that and believed that black people were inferior. And John Brown did not believe that. He was, because he didn't believe that, he saw slavery as a much more profound wrong than a lot of abolitionists did, and was willing to go a lot further to put a stop to it. And I really admire that because I felt like he was really ahead of his time in that respect, and you just have to admire a visionary. And, he had an idea that the Harpers Ferry Raid was not going to succeed, but his belief was pretty much that even if it didn't succeed, that it would bring the slavery issue to the fore in the minds of Southerners and Northerners, and of course many historians believe that it was an event that directly led to the Civil War because it made Southerners very paranoid about efforts of abolitionists in the North to end slavery, and they didn't want that. And so, I really detest it when people try to argue with me about the Civil War and try to pretend that the cause of the South was so noble. I mean, I am not saying that the cause of the North was necessarily all that noble, but I do think that the South pretty much forced the North's hand, and I don't think that you could argue that slavery didn't have anything to do with that, like some people will try to argue. That's just ridiculous. The South went to great measures to suppress free speech, abolitionist speech, particularly after the Nat Turner Rebellion in the 1830s. And one story that really jumped out at me in the book is on page 81, talking about Elijah Lovejoy, who dared to speak out against acts of mob violence. One in particular that happened in Missouri, I believe happened in Missouri, in which a mob basically set a black man on fire and killed him. And he wrote an anti-slavery newspaper, I want to say in Ohio, and his press was destroyed twice. In late September of 1837, his house was stoned. He helped organize the Illinois State Anti-Slavery Society, and then he was basically run out of town, and he refused to leave, and 5 days later he was murdered. See, the people that will denounce John Brown, understandably, somewhat, on the grounds that he was violent, I don't think are really taking into account all the violence that was inherent in the system of slavery, for one, and all the violence, too, that abolitionists suffered simply for speaking out against slavery. And there were many instances of people being run out of town, burned out of their homes, lynched. It wasn't like an isolated thing that happened. It was pretty standard, unfortunately. And one thing that did sort of disturb me personally in the book was reading about John Brown going to Kansas and I know I'm gonna butcher this pronunciation, Potawatomi killings, which were basically a response to the burning and pillage of Lawrence, Kansas, which was a town that was very much known for being anti-slavery, and there were pro-slavery people that basically burned the town to the ground and pillaged it. And I mean, they didn't really kill anybody, but it was definitely an effort to intimidate anti-slavery people into allowing slavery in the Kansas Territory. And while I was bothered by the description of John Brown and his posse of people basically hacking to death 5 people who were not slave owners themselves, but were pro-slavery people that were basically committing acts of intimidation and outright, voter fraud and that kind of thing to try to make slavery legal in Kansas. I can understand why a lot of people cringe at that, and I did too. But like I said, when you look at the violence that was inherent in slavery itself and all the people that were killed in cold blood, I could understand back then having the conviction that that violence was justifiable to put an end to violence on a larger scale. And some historians actually have had the nerve to call John Brown a sociopath. He was not a sociopath. The men that he murdered, he could have murdered their families. He could have murdered a lot of, witnesses to I guess the abduction of these men that were subsequently murdered. There are a lot of things that they could have done. When they took hostages in Harpers Ferry, they could have killed them. They didn't have to, especially after the fighting started and there were soldiers trying to take the arsenal back. They could have killed those people, and they didn't. And as a matter of fact, they were more concerned about the well-being of the hostages than the people who were trying to take the arsenal back. And anyway, I don't see how you could possibly think that he was a sociopath. Anybody could say that with a straight face. You know, was he overly idealistic? Yes. Was he, I mean, could you maybe describe him as a religious zealot? Yes. Megalomaniacal? Maybe. But I think that he had a good heart, and I think that he had good intentions, and that is a lot more than you can say for the people that were opposed to him. And I do think that he helped people realize that the slavery issue wasn't going to go away and couldn't be swept under the rug anymore, as it had been for, what, 80 years since the American Revolution. You know, where we have this wonderful Declaration of Independence, in, you know, then we're counting human beings as 3/5 of people, so that slaveholders have a greater legal representation than, you know, everybody else. You know, it's pretty crazy when you think about it. And John Brown recognized that hypocrisy and tried to do something about it, and I definitely admire him for that. So I'm going to close with a quote from the very last page of the book, because I thought it was pretty profound. He said, "The egalitarian ideals and justice-seeking aspirations of the Declaration of Independence hold little interest except as tokens to be spun for those who currently define and would enforce American patriotism. The Christianity that is invoked in our national halls of power has nothing in common with the teachings that John Brown understood to be at the heart of the faith. Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. Do unto others as you would that others do unto you. Inasmuch as ye did to not one of the least of these, ye did it not to me." And I think it's very clear that slavery was a violation of the Golden Rule, and it's very clear that a lot of things that our government does now, or sanctions now, and that a lot of so-called Christian Americans ignore, is just as, a lot of those things are just as wrong as the things that John Brown was opposed to. When you talk about, you know, indiscriminate killing and war, and economic policies that cause poverty around the world, and that kind of thing. So anyway, I just wanted to share that book with you, and hope that you read it, and thank you for watching.